Why do some locomotives have a lot of wheels and some only have a couple? And why do some locomotives have unpowered wheels and some have every wheel being powered? What's up, guys? This is Heis, and today we're going back to Railroad 101 Lightning Round Edition, going to explain every type of wheel arrangement that a steam locomotive can possibly have, asterisk, in 15 minutes. The wheel arrangement of a steam locomotive is defined by what we call the White classification system here in the United States, and it's arranged by the groupings of wheels. You have leading wheels, powered wheels, and then trailing wheels. So something like a 284 has 2 leading wheels that are unpowered, 8 powered driving wheels in the middle, and 4 trailing wheels. Some of these wheel arrangements also have names, and some of them have names that are argued and people can't agree on, and some don't have names, and you'll know they're not too terribly common if they didn't have a name. The fun piece about this, though, is that the White classification system is actually somewhat modern when we think about the history of the railroad, and by somewhat modern, I mean about 1900. So, you know, only 120 plus years old, but in the scheme of the railroad, that's actually kind of new. The man named White was an employee that worked for the New York Central Railroad, and he came up with this. Before this, if you said 440, America wouldn't have known what you meant. They knew it as an American standard or an 8-wheeler. That was that. The other note before we really jump into the list is that a T at the end denotes that it's a tank engine. There's no tender, it's all one encapsulated thing. And for the sake of keeping this to about 15 minutes, the best I can, we'll see how it goes, we're not going to jump into each, that's a tank engine, that's not, just know that that can generally be applied. And also know that there's going to be a ton of wheel arrangements that don't fit the schema, so we're not going to talk about them. Things like Garrett's, Forney's, Mason bogies. Yes, they can be classified in this system, and sometimes with special little extra distinctions, but the broad strokes about what I'm going to teach you don't necessarily apply because of the unique geometric considerations of those locomotives, so we're not going to talk about them in this video. Maybe in another one down the road. And then there's crap like this, where it just, like, literally cannot be classified by the system because it doesn't fit, because it's cursed. We'll also be glossing over those things. So let's start by looking at the wheel arrangements, and we'll kind of learn the whys and the decisions made behind the wheel arrangements along the way. Starting with things that don't have any leading wheels or trailing wheels. The 020, they made those? The Bradford and Foster Brook Railroad had monorails that were technically 020s. Get this crap out of here. Moving on to something normal. The 030 monorail, but also road. India, why'd you no. The 040. Thank God, here we go. The 040 is the perfect small-sized compact locomotive, has all of its power on its drive wheels, and it's really, really small, so it was great and utilized all over many industries to switch things out, because, well, I mean, it's not hugely powerful, because it's only got 4 powered wheels, but it is hugely flexible because of how small it is. The 060. It's a much more common locomotive in the terms of big railroad standard gauge type applications. It's got a lot more power with that additional driver, and it's still relatively in a small package. And this theme continues on for switching type locomotives. An 060, it grows into an 080, into an 010, and even an 012. Yeah, apparently that was a thing. The general thought here was more drivers means more ability to put your weight down in a useful way on the rail. You can only make the drivers so heavy before you start shaking the track or the locomotive to death. So you couldn't really just add density and brick without more drivers. So you had to have the right amount to transmit the force that you wanted to transmit. But you start getting up into the 12 driver range, well, you're kind of stretching things pretty far. You're also losing flexibility the longer you make the rigid wheelbase. The drive sets can't really pivot. They can move laterally a little bit, and so that allows some free play, but you do end up having kind of a hard cap based on the curvature of your railroad, how long you can make this sort of thing. So 8 drivers, absolutely the most common. 10, common enough. People had 10 coupled engines. 12 was starting to get kind of out there, but they did exist, including this 012O. And when you get to 12 drivers, either you're making the drivers really small, or you're limiting the locomotive to the planes, Union Pacific, or, comrade, you have made most perfect train all time, never run anywhere, davai. Thanks, Russia, for that one. So you've probably been wondering, why don't all locomotives just put all their weight on the drivers? That's what makes the locomotive be able to pull things. Why did you have lead or trailing wheels? Well, to quote my friend Stothy, who owns a giant 040, it does the 040 dance. The drivers having a little bit of lateral ability to pivot means that they can help negotiate things through curves a little bit, but they don't inform the frame of the locomotive what to do, because you look at it like it's one big truck, one bogie, one pivoting unit. You have one set with something with no lead or trailing wheels. You just have drivers. If you add leading wheels, you can then add an additional way to inform the alignment of the frame and help the frame more gracefully transition into curves, because you have another location that can pull it around and into the bends. When you look at something like an 040, you have to kind of draw it back further and realize that it's actually like half of a train car, and the point that the body wants to pivot around is in the first coach behind the locomotive. And so it's doing the dance, pivoting around a point in space way behind you. And if it had a lead truck, it wouldn't. The pivot point would be on the frame of the locomotive, and it would be much more stable at speed. So let's talk about leading wheels. The 240. These were an early, small, mixed service type locomotive, and they really were not too terribly common outside of early railroading. This graduates to the 260, the Mogul. A named wheel arrangement. Thank God we've made it. The Mogul was basically your bread and butter default locomotive of the mid to late 1800s. It was really good at pulling freight for the railroad. It was more stable than the 060 because it had the lead wheels, but it still was relatively strong and most of the weight was on the drivers. The 280, the consolidation. We saw the Mogul and we saw 6 drivers and said, you know what? I bet you one more is better. And we were absolutely right. Though actually the first 280 was a modified 080 that they realized was not doing the thing, so they added a lead truck and went, oh man. The 280 ended up becoming the single most produced wheel arrangement in the United States. Most common thing bar none. The Pennsylvania Railroad had more than 5,300 280s. That's more than many railroads have locomotives. That was probably more locomotives as 280s than the state of Colorado had trains at the time. Adding that extra driver was good, right? Let's try it again. The 210, the Decapod. How did it go this time? Oh, well, now that the 280 is kind of the real secret there. Many 210s were made, and they were good engines. They just had a little bit more restrictive service because of the long, rigid frame, and they didn't really offer that much more power than a 280 in most cases. So 2 leading wheels helped inform the frame of the locomotive when it comes to curves. But that same principle worked for then the lead truck. We had 2 wheels, and we could inform it with one position, but if you had 4 wheels, you could inform the exact torque and twist on the truck, which means that you could provide even better feedback to the total frame of the locomotive, and so the 4-wheel lead truck was born. We got arrangements with 4 leading wheels. Starting with the 440, the American. Nothing quite screams cowboy Hollywood action in terms of what you think of when you think 440. This wheel arrangement became the image of the locomotive. These were the locomotives at Promontory Summit. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, it was 2 Americans staring at each other at the very front. The 460, the 10-wheeler, everyone's favorite mixed-use and passenger engine. As the 280 is to freight, the 460 is to passengers. It was more stable because of the 4-wheel lead truck, and only having 6 drivers meant that you could have bigger drivers for more speed than a 280. The 480. Some will call this a mastodon, others will say that they're totally wrong and it's just called a 12-wheeler. Not too super common, but very neat. The 410 is what many people call a mastodon, and somebody call the Central Pacific a ride home. They're drunk. This locomotive was a mistake. El Goob, the Gobernador. they really took this wheel arrangement to its max, the 4X something, and then they found the inherent problems. You had to make a change to actually make the locomotives function and be better. The problems with the design of this locomotive needed to be fixed by adding trailing wheels, which is what we're getting into next. So what's the deal with trailing wheels then? We can understand that you get better curve performance with a lead truck that helps inform the frame, but what's the point? Like, what was wrong with having just a bunch of drivers? Well, if you look at the early locomotives, and all these locomotives have been showing pictures of with no trailing wheels, you'll note that they all kind of tall, or they have really weird driver spacing, because there was this issue that plagued locomotive designers for a long time, where they couldn't figure out how to position the drivers, axles, and the ash pan and the firebox all together. They ended up kind of straddling the firebox or raising it up super high with a smaller boiler so that they could fit the engine underneath, and that wasn't ideal for steam generation. They realized, finally, around the turn of the century into the 1900s, that if you added smaller wheels at the back as trailing wheels, you could put a bigger firebox on a locomotive, have a bigger overall profile and a bigger boiler, which meant you could generate more steam for the engine to use. And so you got the trailing truck. And here's where most of our locomotive wheel arrangements are going to be, because most engines ended up having lead and trail. There were some locomotives that only had trailing trucks and didn't have a lead truck, of course, but they weren't too super common, so we're not going to get into those. But looking at ones that had both trucks, you had the 242, the Columbia. I mean, it's a better 240, but even then 240 really wasn't all that common, so neither was this. The 262. The Prairie, the friend-shaped locomotive. It's the Mogul, but with better steam generation. It wasn't too super common because by the time that people came up with the trailing truck, the locomotives were kind of getting bigger, but Prairie is still a very good locomotive for a smaller railroad. The 282, the Mikado. Not quite as common as the 280 because there had been so many that had been made, but certainly a very good, well-rounded design for freight or slower passenger type services. And they were also known as MacArthur's officially during World War II because Mikado comes from Japan, and you know we can't take something from the enemy as far as a name, even though we've been calling it that for 50 years. The 210-2, the Santa Fe. Arguably more common than the 210-0 because they realized that the big firebox could be a huge benefit. Certainly a great slog-it-out, big, thick locomotive. Moving on to four-wheel lead trucks, 442, the Atlantic, for when you have places to be and you don't really want to pull much. The 462, the Pacific. Like, this is the passenger locomotive of all time. Big drivers, big firebox, the whole thing, stable at speed, awesome. The 482, the Mountain or the Mohawk if you're from New York, very good for freight at higher speeds. The 410-2, the Southern Pacific, for when a 210-2 wasn't quite stable enough for the speed you wanted to run. The 412-2, the Union Pacific, for when you wanted to outdo your buddy from down south and also pull the entirety of Nebraska with one locomotive. The 264, the Adriatic. Lionel would like to know your location. The 284, the Berkshire or the Kanawha if you're on the C&O. I probably pronounced that wrong. The 284, think 282, but with big firebox for really, really slogging it out with a big engine set. Some of the most modern, best designed locomotives of all time, really, this wheel arrangement. The 210-4, the Texas, for when a Berkshire wasn't quite enough or your 210-2 didn't have enough firebox. The 444, the Reading or the Jubilee type. Why'd you make this? The 464, the Hudson, the arguably better version of the 444, where you have the stability and the ability to make a ton of steam, and you also got places to be. Big drivers. The 466, six-wheel trucks were not super common, but sometimes they were, and these were actually really cool suburban tank engines in many cases. The 484. Perhaps the most well-known and celebrated wheel arrangement because of how famous and notorious some of these locomotives were. The 611, the Daylight, etc. This wheel arrangement probably has the most contested name of all. The Northern Pacific apparently had the first ones, and so most people tend to call them Northerns, but everybody had some opinions, and I'm not even going to read these off. There's the list. The 484 is perhaps the best of the bigger wheel arrangements because it can do the balance of tonnage, and it can do speed, and it's super stable. You saw really great superpower era steam locomotives that utilized this wheel arrangement. So that pretty much sums up all of the single engine stuff. Obviously, there were qualifiers and locomotive types we didn't get into, but that gets you the bread and butter that's probably 99% of locomotives in the United States. So on to double engine locomotives. Double engine locomotives, they might be articulated where they have a hinge pin in their frame so that they can actually pivot around curves. There might be a duplex where it's just one giant frame and they said, you know what, we need more cylinders because we're the Pennsylvania Railroad. They might be simple where all of the steam from the throttle just goes directly to both engine sets at the same time at whatever boiler pressure is. Or they might be compounded, where you run it through one engine, and then like a marine engine, you take the exhaust from the one engine and run it in the second. And you can kind of see some of the details that makes those by the size of their cylinders. The pressure in the second engine's lower, so usually they had god-awful gigantic cylinders. The 4444. The Pennsylvania Railroad would like to know your location. The 6446. The Pennsylvania Railroad would still like to know your location. The 4464, Pennsylvania, what are you doing? The 4644, Pennsylvania, put the whiskey down. Yeah, they really just made all sorts of crazy duplexes, and some of them were killer. It's a shame that they cut pretty much all of them, if not all of them up. They might have actually scrapped every single one. Antimatter, I'm looking for a comment. The 0660. Old mod, or the mod type. The Baltimore and Ohio had the first Malley, which is a compounded articulated locomotive in the United States, and it was an 0660. And then the 2660, for when you realize that your 0660 is horrendously unstable at track speed. The Denver and Salt Lake Railroad actually had 0660s, and they said, no, this is awful, please fix it. And then they made them 2660s. The 2662, big and powerful, but not so big and ridiculous that you couldn't do industrial things. A lot of logging lines had these. The 2664, for when you wanted a 2662, but it needed more squeaky whistle. The 2666, the Allegheny, for when you just needed firebox, all firebox. The 4664, the Challenger. Perhaps one of the most beautiful and well-balanced and symmetric designs in terms of locomotive suspension and the way they operated. The 2880, the Bull Moose. The Great Northern would like to know your location. The 2882, this is one of the biggest locomotive types around and really slogged it out with the best of them. The 2884, the Yellowstone. More powerful than the Big Boy. I still need to do that video, don't I? And speaking of the 4884, the Big Boy, Union Pacific had him, and I don't think anyone else did. It was just a UP thing. Theoretically more stable than the Yellowstone, but the Yellowstone, honest to God, the ones from the DM&IR actually did outpull the Big Boy. The 21010-2. Somebody take the whiskey away from the Santa Fe. And the 2888-2 and the 28884. Somebody take the alcohol away from the railroaders. They need to stop. Yeah, the triplexes, 3 engines, just a cluster. Not good. They did not succeed for many reasons, and they were also extremely strange, where they had a high-pressure engine, and then one cylinder fed the other engine at the back, and one cylinder fed the engine at the front, so they were kind of compound, but with restricted flow, and they didn't generate enough power because the 2 and then the 4, I mean, they didn't have enough firebox for 3 engines. Yeah, they were not really that successful. Anyways, guys, Hope you like this generic look at a lot of the wheel arrangements and why, and hopefully you learn something along the way of this is why the wheel arrangements are and how important they were to the railroad and the class of service they were trying to provide with their engines. And hopefully this was 15 minutes. I might edit something in because it was probably way more than 15 minutes, but we'll see. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. We will catch you all next time.